Welcome back, everybody, and let's dive right into our third lecture. This lecture, of course, being on Islamic scripture. Now, unlike other people of the book, which is what Muslims call Jews and Christians, the Islamic scripture was written by one person, and so it is remarkably consistent both in its themes and its tone. Traditionally, Muslims believe that the author is Allah, God, as transmitted through the archangel Gabriel to a single human prophet. So let's talk about that prophet, because we can't really understand Islamic scripture unless we understand him. In the early 7th century, we have this young man who is deeply disturbed by the troubles that are facing his community, and so he climbs Mount Hira to pray. He enters a cave near the mountain's peak, and as he did every time at this time of the year, he poured out his heart before Allah, the God. The silence of the cave soothed his spirit, and though he was filled with turmoil, he found a bit of peace there. And then one night, as he was sleeping after a long day of prayer, this presence seized him. He felt like his ribs were being crushed, and an angel spoke to him strange and beautiful words which were both frightening and prophetic. He was shaken by this experience, and when he returned to his city, he asked his wife to cover him. Basically, throw a blanket over me, protect me from this mysterium tremendum experience that has overwhelmed me. He was so frightened that he only told his wife and her cousin about what had happened. Maybe these words are from God, they told him. But he was not so sure. The visitations continued, each one as painful and frightening as the last, and more words came too. Gradually, he understood that Allah was speaking to him and through him, and that these words were not simply the result of a dream or an overactive imagination, but they were the words of a new scripture, a gift of the God to his people, this young man's people, Muhammad's people. As with all scripture, the Quran emerged because of a crisis that was rocking the community, specifically Muhammad's community, the Arab people around the city of Mecca. Now, the Arab peoples had long felt inferior to their neighbors. They believed that Allah had sent prophets to all of the people around him and had delivered to every people a holy book. But the God had sent no one to them. Did God not care about them? The Zoroastrians had Zarathustra, and through him they received the Holy Gathas. The Jews had been sent Moses, and the Torah was their holy book. Allah had sent Jesus to the Christians, and the Gospels were for them the words of life. But where was the prophet for the Arabs? And where was their holy book? The young man, Muhammad of the Quraysh tribe, felt this mixture of gratitude and fear. He was grateful that Allah had not forsaken them, but he was terrified to have been the one chosen to deliver this new holy book. The first 5 verses of Surah 74 in our reading was the very first revelation given to Muhammad. O thou who art covered, arise and warn. Basically, hey you, the one hiding under the blanket, get up and start warning people. I mean, hey, if it had been me, I'd have been hiding under a blanket too. Muhammad had every right to be scared. His people were not likely to be receptive to the kinds of messages that he was receiving. His society was a deeply divided society, composed of many different tribes, all of which seemed to be at one another's throats. Blood feuds were the order of the day. Now, if you haven't heard of blood feuds, they're actually pretty simple. If I discover that one of my goats is dead, and it's near the border of your property, well, you must be responsible for it, so I'm going to go and kill one of your goats in retaliation. I have to, otherwise it will bring dishonor upon my people. I can't just let you kill one of my goats and get away with it, right? So I've got to kill one of your goats. But you can't let that stand. You've got to come and kill 2 of my goats now. or you'll lose face in front of your family. I can't let that stand. I've got to go and kill 2 of your goats and 1 of your cows. You can't let that stand. You've got to come and kill 3 of my goats, 1 of my cows, and my sister. I can't let that. You see how this goes? And it just escalates. It doesn't de-escalate. It just gets worse and worse. So these blood feuds are happening not just from one tribe to another, but between one tribe and every other tribe. You can see that with these blood feuds just rampant in society, how the antagonism kept them at odds with one another and prevented them from building any kind of prosperous society. They certainly did not have the kind of peace and prosperity that their neighbors enjoyed. And by neighbors, I'm talking about the Jews and Christians who had a sense of order in their communities. Furthermore, the tribes all honored their own gods, and they were looked down upon by their Jewish and Christian neighbors as being pagans, as being culturally backwards and religiously unsophisticated. But the revelations that Muhammad was receiving, they were calling for a new kind of society to come into being. It prophesied a society that honored one God. It prophesied a society that upheld justice for the weak and for the vulnerable. A society that outlawed revenge and bloodshed and blood feuds. The revelations called for the birth of the just society, the Ummah. United by one faith, governed by one law. It was a way out of the wilderness of tribal warfare and conflicting traditions and the rampant greed that pervaded Muhammad's society. And this path out of the wilderness of chaos was made known to Muhammad, but he was terrified to speak it. Surely he would be killed if he did, because his revelations called for an end to the only political and cultural system his people had ever known, and those in power are not going to relinquish that power without a fight. So at first, Muhammad just kept quiet, sharing his revelations only with his family, but after a couple of years, he felt moved to begin preaching. So he did. Some people believed him, and they followed his teachings, but most ridiculed him or simply ignored him. One of our surahs arose out of this exact crisis in Muhammad's prophetic career. He was preaching to Arab leaders, trying to persuade them that his revelation was true. One man believed and begged the Prophet to guide him. But Surah 80 says that Muhammad frowned and tried to avoid this man. Why? Because he was blind. And so Muhammad didn't see how the man could be of any account. What good could this blind man possibly be to him? But Allah rebuked him and used this blind man to teach the Prophet an important lesson about humility, about judging people by how they appear on the surface. For when Muhammad embraced Maktoum, he gained one of the wisest and most capable leaders in early Islam. This surah came about because of a personal crisis in the Prophet's own life, his own arrogance that threatened to undermine the whole Islamic community before it was even on solid ground. Muhammad learned a valuable lesson, and he preached to anyone who would receive him, not just the powerful and the wealthy, but anyone who would receive the message. And slowly, Muhammad started to make some headway. One man named Umar ibn al-Khattab fiercely denounced Muhammad and his message. He was a firm believer in the old gods, but Umar was also quite a devotee of Arabic poetry. He had spoken against those teachings that he had heard about, Muhammad's teachings, but he had only heard them secondhand. So when he actually heard the words of the revelation with his own ears being recited, the beauty of the poetry utterly undid him, and his heart melted. And right there and then he became a believer in the new religion, and many other people did too. But, of course, some didn't. Surah 74 goes on to talk about another expert in Arabic poetry who heard the words of the revelation but was unimpressed. To those who heard the message but disparaged it, Muhammad was told to relate a severe warning. May he perish for how he determined. But in fact, plenty of folks determined against the prophet. It didn't help that the revelation was directly opposed to much in Arabian society. The Arabs were a proud people, and unlike those in the empires that surrounded them, they served no monarch and they bowed to no man. Muhammad knew that it was precisely this fierce pride that was the cause of so much suffering among his people. It was pride that prevented one tribe from forgiving another, allowing the rivalries to escalate and wreak so much havoc on society. It was pride that caused men to oppress the women even in their own families, where tribal law insisted that the poor and the weak should be provided for. The booming trade business that had arisen in just the last generation had brought with it a pervasive greed that ignored this tribal wisdom. In contrast to this, Muhammad's revelation insisted that all people from high to low humble themselves and bow, not before any human being, but before God. And not just in their hearts, but in their bodies, and not just in private, but in public. The new religion became known as Islam, which means submission. Muhammad insisted that believers bow down before Allah publicly, not just once, but several times a day. When you think of it, it was a program of aggressive re-education. Instead of fighting one another, Muhammad insisted that the greatest struggle, the greatest jihad, was an internal struggle. It was a struggle against pride and ego, greed and selfishness and cruelty and stubbornness. It insisted that the good of society as a whole outweighed the good of one's own family or tribe, and that forming the just community, the ummah, was more important than accumulating personal wealth or defending the honor of one's own tribe. As you might expect, this was a hard message to hear, and fierce opposition to the prophet's message arose. After about 4 years of preaching, nearly 70 families had converted to Islam. But the chiefs of the tribes had become openly hostile. They forbade any of their people to trade with Muhammad's tribe, or any of his converts, or even to marry anyone in his tribe. Later, Muhammad's uncle died, and without a powerful clan member to protect him, he became easy prey for those who opposed him. Things did not look good for Muhammad at this point in time, but an unexpected thing happened. An envoy from another city, Yathrib, sought Muhammad out and made him a proposition. Their own community was also torn apart by tribal feuding, just as much as his own, but they had had some contact with Jews. They were not unfamiliar with monotheistic faith. They offered to convert to Islam if Muhammad would move to their city and be their ruler, to end their infighting and their factionalism and bring about the dream of the just society, the just community, and bring this to fruition in their own midst. It seemed too good to be true. But soon Muhammad was convinced of their sincerity, and under the cover of night, the Muslims of Mecca slipped out of the city and made their way to Yathrib. They renamed their new home Al-Medina, the city, and they set about creating the just society, just as directed by Muhammad's continuing revelations. They built a mosque, they devoted themselves to daily prayer and other spiritual disciplines, and they forged alliances with the local, with a lot of the local tribes. But almost immediately, the prophet met with trouble. The leaders of the city might have invited the prophet to lead them, but there were plenty of folks in Medina who weren't keen on this whole submission business, as you might imagine. The shortest of our surahs, Surah 83, came about because of what might sound to us like a pretty mundane crisis, and yet it threatened to frustrate the whole Islamic project. It seems that there were merchants in Medina who were putting their thumbs on the scales and cheating people when buying or selling. In a movement built on nakedness before God, absolute honesty and transparency, this kind of fraud simply could not stand, especially since it was the poor that would suffer the most from this kind of dishonest dealing. And so it was, in order to put an end to this criminal activity, that this surah was given, proclaimed. But it was probably written down a bit later because there continued to be people who were dealing dishonestly, and everyone needed a good reminding that this kind of behavior does not go unnoticed by Allah, and that at judgment such behavior will be severely punished. To them, Muhammad is saying, there is a book, and your deeds will be written down, but your crimes have caused rust to grow on your hearts, and God will throw all of you rusty-hearted people into hellfire. And he's especially pointing this warning at those who think that religion in general, and Muhammad's religion in particular, is just a fairy story. The language of this and many other surahs can seem harsh and kind of extreme to us today. But it's important to remember what a harsh and dangerous world Muhammad was born into. He needed to get people's attention. And being subtle about things, like making suggestions, gosh, wouldn't it be better not to cheat people, that wasn't going to persuade anyone, especially those who have been getting away with it from a very long time and had grown plenty rich by it. So it was a harsh message for a harsh world, a harsh warning for harsh people who thought nothing of taking a poor widow's last penny. There were plenty of other crises that threatened the early Islamic community, and the Quran emerged bit by bit in order to meet each of these challenges as they emerged. Now, Muhammad was not a systematic theologian. He didn't just lay out a well-organized statement of the faith. Other theologians would do that later in the Islamic faith. But instead, Muhammad was what we might call a reactive theologian, meaning that his teachings developed over time in reaction to various crises faced by the early Muslim community. To read the Quran is to read the history of these crises. The problem is that it's all out of order. So you can't read the exciting story of the early years of Islam just by reading the Quran because it's not a novel. Instead, you have to really study it and lean on those who have spent their lives and careers studying the Quran to determine which surahs were written when and in reaction to what crises. For some of these, it's hard to tell what the exact crisis actually was, but for others it's pretty obvious, and sometimes the surah will come right out and tell you. The three surahs that we read for our assignment are pretty good examples of those that come right out and tell us what Muhammad was dealing with. And of course, as with all scripture, the crisis the community was dealing with is still with us. We're still afraid to speak up when the divine calls us to do so. We still misjudge people by their appearance or their seeming abilities. We still have those who cheat the poor among us, swindling those on fixed incomes of their savings and seeking advantage against the vulnerable and the weak. I don't know about you, but there are people out there that I'd just like to give a good shake, and Muhammad's warnings, they do exactly that. Maybe not the wording I'd use, but I'm not living in Arabia in the 7th century. Muhammad knew what he was doing, or Allah did. Either way, his reactive theology struck a chord and began one of the most enduring and popular religions that the world has ever seen.